Habitats are where things live. Okay, so in this video, what we're going to do is describe the different habitats around the world. And from that, we're going to explain how different habitats can be found within a given area. So let's just start off by thinking about where we live. We live here on planet Earth. Now that's quite a broad description of where you live. You don't live in the whole of the planet, so we can be a bit more specific. For example, you live on the continent of Europe, but you don't inhabit the entire continent. You live perhaps within the United Kingdom. You don't, again, inhabit the whole of the United Kingdom. You might visit different parts of it, but the key thing is you don't necessarily live in the whole area of the United Kingdom. So again, we go a bit closer to maybe a county, for example, Devon. And again, you don't live in the entire region of Devon. So we might break this down to a particular town or city, in this case, Plymouth. And again, it's worth, I think you get the idea at this point. You could break this down further by area of the city, the street, or even the house number. But you don't occupy the entire area mentioned at each stage. There may even be areas of the city that you don't ever visit. So that isn't classed as your habitat. And this is the same for organisms. Organisms tend not to live within an entire biome or area. So what we need to start to think about then is how we go about defining the habitat of an organism. Now, habitats, we're going to give 3 examples in this particular case, and it will differ from place to place. And again, it will differ from organism to organism, from species to species. So the first example we're going to have a look at is the African savanna. Now, on the African savanna, we have some extremely famous animals, including elephants, giraffes, zebras, antelope, gazelle, wildebeest, hyenas, all sorts of things like that. Now, what we'll probably notice on this particular example is that most of the organisms live on grassy plains in this particular case. In fact, most of the organisms will rely on the grassy plains to survive, to get water, to get food, be that lions eating the wildebeest or the zebras using the watering hole. Some organisms may live in the trees. So some of the birds, for example, might live predominantly in the trees and then maybe feed on the ground occasionally. Some organisms, such as anteaters and some other animals, may live underground. And this is another different habitat again. And you might also include things like termites that build underground burrows as well. And these all form key parts of ecosystems that we're going to look at further into the course. Okay, let's have a look at another example. So moving on to the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest is extremely diverse. We can see birds, we can see monkeys, we can see rodents, we can see big cats, we can see reptiles. In amongst this will be lizards, amphibians, and all sorts of things that you can probably imagine within this particular region. Now, the rainforest itself can actually be broken down into 4 distinct areas. These are listed here. So at the top of the trees, we have the emergent layer. This is essentially the tops of the trees where you'll get some sunlight. We then have the canopy. So this is the kind of bulk of the area where the leaves are of the trees. We then have the understory. This is predominantly where the trunks of the trees sit, and some smaller trees. And then we have the forest floor. This is where we'll find a lot of ferns, and we'll get a lot of leaf litter and things like that. Now, some creatures will live their entire lives in one layer. So if we go into this particular shot here, you might notice there's some monkeys living in the canopy here, and they will generally live in the canopy. It's safe from predators. They might occasionally drop down to the forest floor, but they shouldn't need to. They can jump from tree to tree. Now, what we also find in this particular image are some crocodiles and maybe alligators as well, and they will live in the rivers, but they may also occasionally go onto the banks and live on the forest floor. There's no way these things are getting up into the emergent layer. They cannot climb trees, so they live predominantly on the base, the understory, in the understory and in the leaf litter. There are some other creatures, again, that have formed the ability to burrow, and again, that can be about keeping safe from predators. And this is an example of a pig, and some creatures that will live underground, and they'll live again predominantly on the forest floor. Okay, the last example, we're going to go into a marine habitat. So in this particular marine habitat, it's a coral reef. Coral reef, in this particular example, we have a huge range of different organisms that are living in this area and different habitats that sit within this area. For example, we have some fish that will live under the coral, and they'll burrow into any kind of nooks and crannies, and they'll just stay in those particular regions. You might also consider things like clownfish that live inside anemones. They tend to not leave that area for the safety. We have here lobsters that may live on the seabed. They may venture out into the sandy areas to find food. We have a seagrass bed here where we have some sea snakes. You might get eels that live in these areas, and you might also find seahorses that live in that particular area and won't venture necessarily into the coral reef for any given reason. We then have large creatures like this. There's no way they're going to be fitting into small nooks and crannies in amongst the coral, and they'll just generally float around on the top. They're quite large, so they're safe from predation, and they may well feed on smaller fish. And we also have jellyfish, and the jellyfish, they tend to be moving on the currents. They don't have much ability to decide where they go. They may enter into the coral reefs occasionally, and they certainly might spawn in these regions, but they're generally then also able to go out into the open ocean as well. So an area may contain many different habitats. So by looking at just one particular place, you can start to identify these habitats. Some organisms will remain within one habitat. It might be something static, like a plant, in which case it's only going to have one habitat. It might be something mobile, like an animal, that may stay in one place for safety, like a clownfish, or it may move around from place to place to find food and shelter. Other organisms, they may move between different habitats to survive in that particular case. Okay, to summarize in this particular video, habitats are the physical places where organisms live. They're specific to each species, and what we also understand is that some organisms remain within one habitat for their entire life cycle. For example, a plant at the bottom of a lake, for example, they may not leave that lake at any particular point. Other organisms may move between different habitats to survive. So this may include maybe your monkeys in the rainforest that may spend a lot of the time on the emergent layer, and they might occasionally drop down into the forest floor to find food if the need arises. Few organisms have adapted to migrate between different habitats and biomes. So you might, for example, consider the caribou in North America that move between the tundra and the boreal forests, and they migrate. A lot of birds will spend different times, say in the UK, and they may migrate to Africa, and they do that to find food and shelter at different times of the year depending on the climate. So it depends very much on the species that you consider, but that covers the content on habitats.